Jonathan Campbell here. We're looking at a couple of books today. First book I want to look at is called The Third Spectrum, or Spectrum 3, and it has it's a collection of science fiction books compiled by two people, not whom you'd suspect to be collectors of science fiction: Kingsley Amis, literary writer, and Robert Conquest, noted historian. And it was Conquest who said in one of his books, Ravaged Century, I believe, if I can remember correctly, people should and ought to read science fiction because it prepares you to deal with the unexpected, to deal with alien cultures, literally in this case, but it gives you, it fortifies you to be prepared to deal with the unexpected. Great advice. And they have compiled Amis, I beg your pardon. Kingsley Amis was the father of Martin Amis, recently deceased, both noted literary writers. And so they've collected in this number 3. I don't have the first and second, but this is the sort of thing, when you see it at a bookstore, you say, better pick that up, and make sure you keep your eye out for volumes 1 and 2, because it'll make a nice little set. And in here they have Theodore Sturgeon, Mark Rose, Arthur C. Clarke, J.G. Ballard, Murray Leinster, Alfred Bester, Poul Anderson, and Peter Phillips. I've heard of most of these, and I've read most of them. A few I have not. But this is the sort of thing when you start getting into or involved in any sort of literary genre, if you read widely in that, and I'm not entirely read widely in science fiction, I enjoy it in the same way I suspect Amis and Conquest enjoyed it. They didn't become scholars to my knowledge, but they were well enough known in literary and historical circles to be taken seriously by science fiction publishers. And so all of these, this is a great recommendation to read science fiction. I recommend it as well. I hang upon their coattails and recommend it as well. All right, the second book we'll look at is called In Between the Mud and the Pink Lotus by Tony Taylor. And this is published 2025, Precocity Press. And Tony, I should say, full disclosure, is the author. I know Tony Taylor. She's a friend of my wife's. And so we purchased her book, and I'll say a few words about it now. It's not a novel, so what you're looking at is as the subtitle says, Stories of Memories. It's a series of, they're not completely disconnected. There is a unifying thread going through this, and that's Tony's life. And that's the narrative that goes through it. So you're not, these are not disconnected short stories or novels. It's more of a, closer to a short story cycle, if anything. And but the unifying thread, of course, is Tony. And the epitaph, I was heartened to see, is from Late Fragment by Raymond Carver. And as a matter of fact, I think I overlooked that when I first read this book. And I was looking at one of the stories in this called The Wedding. Tony Taylor writes very well of food and uses that as a very effective metaphor. And we have all experienced, sit down dinners and food, and the lusciousness of food and the sensuality of food. She does this very well. And one of the stories does remind me of A Small Good Thing by Raymond Carver. I don't know if Tony has read that story, but her story is not as sociologically minded as is Carver's. Doesn't have the clash of different cultures. Rather, Tony Taylor is looking at her own culture and her own background in these stories. And the hook of the book is there's an accident. Sorry, look at these. Isn't that a great picture? She's done all the paintings herself as well. But the hook starts out with an accident, and that brings you into the story. It unfolds after that with what I would say is flight. And by that I mean momentum. Does this book have momentum? Is it able to carry you forward? The answer is yes. It has momentum. It can carry you forward. Now, flight is, in poetry, they talk about flight being able to carry you, to suspend your disbelief, to magically carry you along. And it's widely acknowledged that John Milton in Paradise Lost is the most effective poet in English to have ever done this. More effective than Shakespeare. So when I read for flight. I read for momentum. I read for when will this book let me down, not disappoint me, but let me down. Does it have momentum? And the answer is yes. This book has momentum, which is effective. It's effectively done. And you come into there's some shocking stories in here. There are funny stories. She talks about her a parade of characters that are her cats and her pets, and they too have their almost like a parable. They have their some of these stories read like parables. They have their effectiveness in that way. And as I said before, shocking. Some of the details are, and so you're not surprised to find mention of people in what do they all do in California? They therapy. They go to therapy, and so it's therapeutic, and it reads much so like that. In that here are the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune affecting people. How do they get through this? And so this is Tony's journey through. And it's as I said, it looks like to be it's a very handsome volume. It has some very effective passages, and it is worth the read for anyone who wants to know or has an interest in how people can confront the troubles in their lives and deal with them. And one way is writing. So Tony's an effective writer in that regard, and In Between the Mud and the Pink Lotus is a good example of that.